What if the Volt were to come into Apex Legends as the next gun in Season 5? This is not something that is confirmed by Respawn or anything like that, but it's a question that I get all the time from my viewers on Twitch and some on YouTube. So I figured, why don't we make a video talking about if the Volt were to come into Apex Legends, what might that look like? What might the stats be, and how might it work? Let's dive in. Just to reiterate, this video is purely speculative in nature. It is purely filled with nothing but guesswork and assumptions. I think the best way for building the Volt in Apex Legends and deciding what the stats might be, and I guess making those guesses of what the stats might be, would be first to look at Titanfall 2, not only for the stats of the Volt itself, but also for some other guns that were brought forward from Titanfall into Apex to see how those guns were converted for this game's play space, and then we can make a little bit more of an informed guess of what the Volt might look like. So, first off, Respawn tends not to change the fire rate for their full auto weapons between Titanfall 2 and Apex. To give two examples, the Alternator sits at 600 RPM in both games, while the R301 sits at 810 RPM in both games. Many other full auto guns also follow this schema, but I'll spare you the details. If we were to speculate on the Volt's fire rate in Apex Legends, the most logical answer would be to pull the value straight from Titanfall 2 with no changes, which would be 660 RPM. Next, we can compare damage stats between both games. In Titanfall 2, weapons had damage fall off with range. This is only true of hit-scan weapons in Apex Legends like the Charge Rifle and Havoc with Select Fire. It's safe to assume that if the Volt were to come into Apex Legends, it wouldn't be a hit-scan weapon, and would not be subject to damage fall-off with range. In Titanfall 2, the Alternator did a maximum of 35 damage, dropping to 18 at far range, and 14 at very far range. In Apex Legends, the Alternator does a flat 15 at all ranges. In Titanfall 2, the R301, or it should be called R201, did a maximum of 25 damage, dropping to 15 at far range, and no further drop-off from that point, if I'm not mistaken. In Apex Legends, it deals 14 damage at all ranges. Finally, in Titanfall 2, the Spitfire did a maximum of 35 damage, dropping to 25 at far range and 20 at very far. In Apex Legends, the Spitfire does 18 at all ranges, so it's not out of the realm of possibility for a weapon in Apex Legends to, on average, deal about its minimum possible damage from Titanfall 2 and Apex with some minor changes. That's going to be our rule of thumb for the rest of this video. Assuming that this is the case, let's take a look at the stats for the Volt in Titanfall 2. 25 damage at close range, dropping to 15 at far range and 12 at very far range. Let's assume that the Volt, if brought to Apex, will deal 12 damage per shot, using our rule of thumb, at a rate of fire of 660 rounds per minute. That would give us a DPS of 132, with a time to kill of who cares, that's way too slow, and Respawn should never release a gun that is that weak. For reference, of all the full auto SMGs, the Alternator sits with the lowest DPS of 150. Its time to kill is often 0.2 to 0.3 seconds slower than its cousins in the SMG category, yet is cited by many players to be quote-unquote good enough, and in some cases preferable to the R99 if the player is not comfortable in their ability to instead control an R99. I personally do not agree with this take, but if my comment section is anything to be believed, this is an opinion a lot of players have. Now, without getting too deep into a philosophical argument about how powerful the Volt quote-unquote should be, let's assume it'll basically sit at parity with and be a competitor to the Alternator instead of the other SMGs in the category. In Titanfall 2, both guns had excellent hipfire, and with proper tap firing could be used at ludicrous range without ever aiming down the sights. More so the Alternator than the Volt, but both were still great. In Apex Legends, the Alternator doesn't quite have the same range performance while being hip-fired specifically, but it's still got a phenomenal hip-fire spray pattern that's very easy to control. It stands to reason that the Volt would perform pretty similarly in this way, and be a direct cousin as a slower firing but more precise SMG. Let's instead assume the Volt damage is bumped up a few points, and we're going to call it 14 damage per shot. This would put us at 154 DPS, and a time to kill of about 0.64 seconds versus an unarmored target, and about 1.27 seconds versus purple armor. So pretty much exactly at parity with the alternator. What we also know at this point is that energy mags are not in Apex Legends anymore. They were removed from the loot pool. Because of this, one of the Havoc's major characteristics is that it spawns with a massive 32 round magazine. Now I know Season 5 is upon us in a few weeks, and that's likely to change, and I think confirmed to change, but I can only speculate so much in one video. I have to assume some constants, so we'll assume that the Havoc having a very large base magazine size is a design decision that we can translate back to the Volt. So, with this assumption in mind, we can perhaps assume that the Volt will compensate for its low damage by having great accuracy and a generous magazine size at base. Energy weapons have typically been unable to equip barrel attachments throughout the history of Apex Legends, so it's reasonable to assume that the Volt will be excluded as well, but it's certainly possible that it might be the exception that could have one. We just don't know yet, assuming it would ever even come into the game at all. This puts us in the same position as the Havoc. Only 2 base attachment slots, optics and standard stock. Havoc gets the select fire hop-up as well as an added benefit. Will we see a hop-up for the Volt appear in Season 5 or beyond? My guess is no. Since we already tried Disruptor rounds once, and despite being nerfed 2 or 3 times, they were still pretty much a hard requirement to use because they were just so good. So to summarize, the prediction on the Volt so far is basically this. I am guessing it's going to have alternator adjacent damage, recoil, and handling characteristics. I'm guessing it'll have a noticeably bigger base magazine, with no potential for a magazine upgrade later on. Finally, I'm guessing we'll see it only have 2 equipable attachments in total, with hop-up compatibility being unlikely unless something new is introduced specifically for the Volt, and 1 or 2 other weapons. I do not predict Disruptor rounds returning. What are some other predictions that we can make then? Well, energy weapons tend to have projectile speeds in the high 700s to low 800s in units of meters per second. Energy weapons tend to have the fastest projectile speed in their respective categories. Even the G7 had its projectile speed nerfed in order to keep this fact true after it was swapped back to assault rifle status. This seems to be one of Respawn's philosophies for balancing this game, where fundamental ideas drive balance seemingly more than everything else in some cases. As a second example, this mode of thinking is why sniper ammo stack sizes were nerfed from 20 to 16. It was to bring the stacks into parity with shotgun ammo, per Jason McCord in my Twitch chat when the Old Ways event first went live. It didn't really have to make sense from a balance standpoint, it just had to make sense from a yup, this looks nice and neat standpoint. No spaghetti. SMGs tend to have really slow projectile speeds compared to assault rifles and light machine guns, sitting between 457 meters per second and 533 meters per second. The Volt has 2 potential modes it could work under here. Either it just barely ekes out its cousins and sits around 550 meters per second to 600 meters per second, or Respawn could do something really interesting here. They could offset this weapon's potential low DPS and slow TTK by giving it crazy fast projectiles, like Havoc speed or better. I'm talking 775 meters per second or better. That would really make this gun feel unique when compared to the other SMGs, and if it ends up having easy recoil to boot, you might just feel more comfortable equipping a 2x bruiser on this thing instead of a traditional 1x optic. Suddenly, the gun becomes a laser beam like the Havoc or R301, trading damage for AD strafing speed. Stick this on a Wraith, and you're in business in the early game and the mid game. With all that being said, what do you all think? If the Volt were to return to Apex Legends from Titanfall in Season 5 or beyond, what would you like to see it do? How would you like to see it perform? Should it be an alternator adjacent? Should it be an R99 or Prowler competitor? Should Disruptor rounds come back? Or maybe Disruptor rounds could be adapted from the Sentinel, and this gun could also have a similar mechanic where you could put a shield cell or shield battery into the Volt to make it stronger? Who knows? Leave me your comments and suggestions down below, because I'd love to hear some of the other theory crafting for what this gun might be able to do if it were to be brought into Apex Legends. Personally, if it were my choice, I wouldn't bring the Volt back at all, and I would probably do something like an energy pistol instead of an energy SMG to maybe spice up the pistol meta a little bit and make it so there are other things besides Hammerpoint P2020 and I guess the Wingman, right? Maybe if there was a third weapon in there that could potentially be into endgame usable, could be really neat. But there's no word on whether or not we might see an energy pistol, but maybe we could make another video like this Volt one where we just theory craft and make up an energy pistol. What do you guys think? Let me know down below what you want to see. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video or over on Twitch where I stream multiple days per week, and I hope to see you again very soon. Take care.